Can you believe that a slight nudge of a steering wheel could trigger an event that left an entire town speechless? Have you ever seen an elderly man get slapped to the ground in broad daylight and no one did a thing? And have you ever witnessed a military helicopter land in the middle of Main Street just for a man who's nearly 90 years old? Sounds like something out of a movie? This story is 100% real, and it's not just about justice. It's about something our modern world is losing fast: respect, dignity, and the quiet heroes who once protected us before we even knew their names. Frank Delaney was an old man living alone, a former combat engineer who served in 3 major campaigns, a veteran. He never bragged, never asked for anything. No one remembered his name. No one even knew he was still alive. Until one Tuesday morning, when the entire city was forced to see him with new eyes. In just a moment, you'll witness how a slap to an old man's face became the wake-up call a whole community needed. How a quiet father, a veteran, raised a son strong enough to change everything without ever pulling a gun. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find yourself asking this. In a world too busy to notice the man sitting alone on a park bench, how many Franks have we already walked past? Let's begin this story. It's not about anger. It's about something far more powerful: the deep respect owed to those who once wore the sacred title of veteran. It was a quiet Tuesday, the kind where the world moves slowly, coffee brews in corner diners, postmen nod to familiar faces, and nothing ever really happens. Frank Delaney, 82, stepped out of Murphy's Pharmacy like he always did. Same bench coat, same soft steps. In one hand, a paper bag with a loaf of rye, a tin of cough drops, and a postcard he'd been meaning to send to his grandson, now a cadet at West Point. Across the street, a group of bikers stood outside Sullivan's bar, all leather and laughter, their chrome bikes lined up like trophies. Frank didn't flinch. He'd seen noise in places where silence meant danger. He simply walked his line, one step at a time. And then, it happened. As Frank passed one of the motorcycles, the edge of his coat brushed against a handlebar, just a soft graze. The bike rocked but didn't fall. Frank stopped immediately. He turned around, palms up. "Sorry about that, son. This coat's older than your ride," he said with a gentle smile. There was no sarcasm, no malice, just the kind of kindness old men carry when they've seen too much to be angry. But kindness doesn't always land where it should. The tallest biker stepped forward, sunglasses hiding whatever thoughts might have passed behind his eyes. He didn't ask if the bike was okay. He didn't speak. He just slapped Frank across the face. It wasn't loud because of the sound. It was loud because of the silence that followed. Frank hit the pavement, one knee buckling beneath him. The paper bag tore. The rye loaf rolled into the gutter. And the people around him? They did nothing. Someone looked, then looked away. A server behind the diner window paused, then went back to clearing plates. One man sipped his beer. Another laughed, unsure why. Frank didn't cry out. He didn't raise his voice. He slowly reached for the loaf of bread, brushing it off like it still mattered, like he still mattered. And maybe that's the most painful part, not the slap, but the feeling that no one cared enough to ask if it hurt. He limped to the bench at the bus stop, the one no one ever sat on unless they were lost or waiting for something that never came. He didn't curse, didn't shake his fist at the world. He just sat there, quiet, steady, holding the torn bag like it was the last thing holding him together. Frank was a veteran. He'd pulled men out of burning vehicles. He'd patched bullet holes with his bare hands. But in this moment, all he wanted was for someone to hand him his cane. It was just a Tuesday, until he pulled out his phone, an old flip model with a cracked screen, and pressed a single contact marked Sparrow 1. He didn't speak. He didn't need to, because that wasn't just a call. It was a signal. And that's when everything changed. Frank Delaney wasn't famous. He wasn't the kind of man you'd Google or see in parades. He didn't have a biography, a building named after him, or a viral video, at least not until that Tuesday. But make no mistake, Frank was a veteran, not the kind who tells war stories at bars, the kind who comes home quietly, unpacks the uniform himself, folds it without ceremony, and builds a new life in silence. Born in 1942 in rural Indiana, Frank was the youngest of 5 and the first to finish high school. He joined the Army at 19, one part duty, one part escape, and quickly became a field engineer, fixing what others gave up on: machines, supply routes, wounded vehicles, broken systems, and sometimes broken men. 3 tours: Panama, Iraq, Kosovo. He never fired the first shot, but he was always the last to leave. Frank saw things he never repeated, and when he came home, he never asked for a thank you. He asked for peace and a routine. Every Tuesday, Frank walked the same 6 blocks to the pharmacy, bought the same rye bread, sent the same kind of postcard to his grandson at West Point. Never long, just proud of you. Stay steady, Grandpa. He lived in a modest apartment above a print shop, never remarried after losing his wife to cancer, never complained when his knees gave out or when strangers rushed past him like he was invisible. Because in a world that often forgets its veterans, Frank had learned to live like a shadow, present but overlooked. Ask around town and you'd get the same answers. Oh, him? Quiet guy. Always at the diner, sits by the window, wears that same coat every season. No one said veteran, no one said hero, because no one ever asked, and Frank never reminded them. But here's the thing about people like him. They don't need parades, but they deserve to be seen. That's what made Tuesday different. It wasn't just a slap on the cheek, it was a slap to every quiet contribution that gets buried under noise. Because when you ignore a veteran long enough, you start to forget what they gave up so you could look the other way. That morning, Frank didn't rise from the bench with fury. He didn't rise at all. He made one call, not for revenge, but for reminder. And reminder came in the form of a chopper, boots on pavement, and a son who hadn't forgotten who his father truly was. But what kind of son answers a silent call without hesitation? And what did he bring with him that changed everything? What do you think could silence a loud, crowded bar in an instant? A helicopter overhead? Or the gaze of a man who spent a lifetime commanding respect on the battlefield? The answer is both. But deeper than that, it was the echo of a vow that's never been broken. We never leave a veteran behind. 15 minutes after the call, the town still looked the same. People passed by the bench without pausing. Frank sat quietly, hands resting on the cane across his lap. No sirens, no drama, just a steady breath, like he was waiting for a bus that only he could see. Then came the sound. At first it was just a faint thrum, barely noticeable, like distant thunder. A few heads turned, a glass on the bar trembled, someone stepped outside and squinted at the sky. And then they saw it, rising from behind the tree line, low, fast, unmistakable. A Black Hawk helicopter. Its rotors sliced through the quiet like a warning. But there was no panic, just awe, because this wasn't an invasion, it was an arrival, with purpose. Seconds later, from the opposite direction, a matte black SUV pulled up and stopped in front of the bar. Doors opened in sync. Boots hit pavement. 12 figures emerged in tactical gear. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They just stood, solid, silent, like a wall between the past and the present. And from the helicopter, one man stepped out. Not young, not old. Sharp eyes, steel jaw, calm like thunder before a storm. He didn't need to say his name. The patch on his chest said enough. Commander R. Delaney, U.S. Army Special Operations. But to Frank, that wasn't a commander. That was his son. He walked straight toward the bench, boots crunching lightly against pavement. Frank looked up, blinked once. They didn't salute. They didn't embrace. Instead, the younger Delaney knelt down, one hand gently brushing the dried blood from his father's cheek. "I got here as fast as I could, Dad," he said, voice low, steady. Frank didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, the entire street knew. This wasn't just an old man. This was a veteran, and more than that, a father whose quiet strength had shaped the kind of son who could silence a city. The biker who struck Frank stepped back unconsciously, the smirk long gone. His friend said nothing. Inside the bar, laughter died. Music stopped. For once, silence wasn't ignorance. It was recognition of a man who had never asked to be seen, but could no longer be ignored. But what happens when strength walks forward, not to destroy, but to demand dignity? Some confrontations end with drawn guns, but others only need a single sentence to make an entire street go still. Because when a soldier speaks on behalf of his father, a veteran who was slapped to the ground while everyone stayed silent, it's no longer a warning, it's a wake-up call. Commander Delaney rose from beside his father. He didn't look back, didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need the sound of steel meeting steel to make people step away. He just looked, and that look made the crowd shrink into itself. He walked toward the group of bikers, slow, not threatening, Not dramatic, but every step landed like a weight on the conscience of those who had turned their backs on the old man sitting behind him. "Which one of you," he said, his voice low, clear, and sharp as an order, "struck a veteran who served this country while you were still learning how to spell your own name?" No one answered. Then, after a pause, the biker, the one who had hit Frank, raised his hand slightly, shoulders hunched like even he didn't understand why this suddenly mattered so much. "Man, it was just some old guy," he muttered. "He bumped my ride." Delaney didn't yell, didn't insult him. He took one more step forward, and that space, the small distance between him and the man who had just spoken, suddenly felt impossible to cross. He locked eyes with him. "That old man is my father," he said. "He is a veteran. He fixed tanks under fire so others could make it home. He carried more weight in silence than you ever will in noise." A wave of silence swept through the block like a receding tide. A boy on the sidewalk lowered his phone. A waitress stood a little straighter, eyes locked, unmoving. The biker looked uncomfortable. "All right, man. I didn't know." Delaney nodded, but his gaze didn't soften. "That's the problem. You didn't know. Because you didn't care." He raised a hand, not high, not rushed, just one steady motion. One of the soldiers behind him stepped back and spoke briefly into a radio. 2 minutes later, a patrol car rolled up. No lights, no siren, just silence. Two officers got out. They didn't ask questions. They looked at Delaney, then at the man whose head was now lowered. Delaney didn't explain. He just pointed, and that was enough. The cuffs clicked softly, not harsh, not rushed, just final, like the closing of a door that should never have been opened. And that was it. The biker got into the squad car, not for the slap, but for forgetting this. Some veterans don't need medals on their chests to deserve respect. Sometimes all it takes is a quiet heart to make an entire town listen. Sometimes what shakes a whole community isn't a helicopter or a SWAT team. It's a trembling handkerchief in the hands of a woman and a single honest sentence. "I should have said something." After the patrol car disappeared down the street, Madison fell into stillness. No chatter, no hurried footsteps, only silence, and a man still sitting on the bench. Frank Delaney didn't look up. He remained exactly as he was, as if nothing had happened, or maybe as if he'd grown too used to things happening without anyone caring. Across the street, a gray-haired woman stood frozen, clutching a white handkerchief. She looked at the old man for a long moment, then slowly walked toward him, carefully, like each step was a journey through her own guilt. When she reached him, she didn't speak right away. She simply bowed her head and held out the handkerchief. Her voice trembled. I should have said something. I'm sorry." Frank looked up. There was no anger in his eyes, only the calm of a veteran who'd grown used to silence and still chose forgiveness. He took the handkerchief and gave a small nod, said nothing. He didn't have to. And that's when something unexpected began to happen. A young man standing near the coffee shop removed his baseball cap and placed his hand over his heart. A father lifted his child onto his shoulders, pointed toward Frank, and whispered something. The little boy raised his hand in a clumsy but earnest salute. A kid no older than 10 stood straight and gave a proper military salute, like the kind he'd only ever seen in movies. No one shouted, no one clapped, they just remembered something they'd forgotten, one by one. Then the veterans began to appear, one in a faded flannel shirt, another in an old Navy cap, stepping out of diners, garages, and the shadows of their own memories to form a quiet line beside Frank, shoulder to shoulder, standing tall, eyes fixed on him. No introductions, no background music, just respect, pure and overdue. Delaney, the son, the soldier, stepped back. He didn't insert himself, because he knew this moment wasn't his. It belonged to a father who had lived his life asking for nothing, and was at last being seen for who he truly was, a veteran, a silent symbol, a living example. Frank lifted his head slightly. He didn't cry, but something in his face loosened, as if a backpack no one saw had finally been set down. No one expected what would happen next. But somehow, the entire nation heard the silence that followed and turned it into action. No filters, no background score, just a video of an old veteran slapped and then sitting quietly on a public bench. And that very silence was what millions couldn't look away from. The first to post the video was a teenager. He had been standing outside the bakery when it all unfolded. He didn't step in, didn't speak, just filmed, with shaky hands, no edits, no music, no clickbait captions, just one line: "We let this happen." Within the hour, the clip spread like wildfire, not because people were outraged, but because they were ashamed. Not everyone had witnessed a veteran being disrespected, but everyone had once walked past someone who needed them and didn't stop. And across the country, people began to ask themselves, how many people like Frank have we failed to see? How many veterans sit on park benches not because they're tired, but because they've become invisible? Morning shows started covering him, not just the incident, but the man, Frank Delaney, Army engineer. 3 campaigns, 1 Purple Heart, a quiet life with no desire for recognition, until a single slap and a crowd silence forced him to become a symbol. The headlines didn't scream. They just said, "A veteran stood alone. Now no one wants to sit down." A group of college students hosted a talk on collective silence. A high school in another state recreated the bench scene and had the entire class stand in silence for 2 full minutes to feel it. A major TV network produced a segment tracing Frank's life, but left the final scene without actors. Just the sound of wind across the real park bench, the one he still sat on every Tuesday. Frank never watched the video. He doesn't use social media, but he knew. Because for the first time in years, when he walked into his usual pharmacy, the young clerk looked at him and said, "Thank you, sir, for everything." Frank just nodded. Because to veterans like him, gratitude doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be seen. And then a call came from the mayor's office, not to apologize, but to ask for permission. They wanted to do something, not for the press, but for him. There was no national anthem play at the start, no fireworks, no gold-trimmed chairs, just a patch of simple grass, a few rows of plastic folding seats, and an entire town rising to honor a veteran who had once been forgotten. The ceremony was held on a Saturday morning. The sky was unusually clear, as if even the weather wanted to fall silent and listen. Frank Delaney arrived, not with his usual slow, steady steps, but in a wheelchair. For the first time, he didn't walk in on his own. For the first time, he let someone push him because for the first time, he didn't feel like he had to carry it all alone. The lawn behind City Hall was packed. Children, seniors, Sena, fellow veterans, ordinary citizens who had once passed him by, and now they stood, not to seek forgiveness, but to express what they had never said. "We see you now, and we know who you are." The high school choir sang the national anthem. Not perfectly. Some notes were off-key, but the sincerity in their voices made everyone hold their breath a little softer. On a small stage, the mayor delivered a brief speech. He ended with these words: "We can never repay the quiet courage of veterans like Mr. Delaney, but we can start by no longer ignoring it." And then the person everyone was waiting for stepped up to the mic. Not Frank, but his son, Commander Delaney. He wore no uniform, just a simple shirt and eyes filled with pride and a touch of emotion. He looked at his father, then at the crowd, and began, "My father never asked for thanks. He never told war stories, but he taught me what strength looks like, by showing up, staying kind, and never asking to be seen." A pause. Then with reddening eyes, he continued, "I've faced combat, I've given commands, but the bravest thing I've ever witnessed was how my father got up from that sidewalk, picked up a loaf of bread, and sat down with dignity while the world walked by." He stepped down, and then Frank, the veteran who had never liked giving speeches, simply raised his hand, slowly, firmly, without saying a word, and the entire crowd stood up, not because they were told to, not because of ceremony, but because they wanted to. The applause lasted nearly 4 minutes, not for medals, not for fame, but for a quiet life, finally seen. No one expected that. Just weeks after the ceremony, Frank would receive a letter, not from an official, but from someone no one thought would ever write. No cameras, no live streams, just a silent room in the local courthouse, and a conversation between 2 men, one who struck, one who was struck, and both, in their own way, were boys carrying wounds from war. 3 days after the ceremony, Frank received a plain brown envelope, no return address, just 6 handwritten shaky words: "If you'll meet me, I'll listen." Frank held the letter for a long time. He said nothing to his son, just folded it and placed it in the pocket of his old coat, right beneath his faded veteran ID. A week later, in a small room behind the courthouse, they met again. No uniforms, no handcuffs. The man who had slapped him, his name was Kyle, walked in wearing a white shirt and eyes no longer full of swagger, his hands clenched, as if he were gripping the last fragile thread of his better self. Frank was already seated, calm. The fluorescent lights overhead revealed the crow's feet around his eyes and the scar on his cheek, an old scar. Not from the slap, but from a piece of shrapnel in 1973. Kyle sat across from him. He didn't know how to begin, but eventually he whispered, "I didn't know who you were." Frank simply nodded. "That's the problem," he said softly. "You didn't care to know." Silence filled the room. Kyle lowered his head, voice breaking. "My dad was a veteran too. Vietnam? He came home, but never really came back. I grew up hating uniforms, blaming them for taking him away, even when he was right in front of me." Frank looked at him, not judging. He'd met too many men like Kyle in his years of service. Men left behind, not by war itself, but by memories that never truly left them. Kyle pulled out a folded piece of paper, his hands trembling as he slid it across the table. "I signed up for therapy. Volunteered at the VA. They say I've got a long way to go." Frank looked at the paper. He didn't need to read it closely. He already knew what it meant, and he did something no one in the room expected. He reached out and placed his hand on Kyle's. A simple gesture. Not forgiveness, but recognition. "You won't fix it all tomorrow, but showing up, that's how you start." Kyle began to cry, not loudly, just a tremble in his shoulders, as if he had finally let go of a backpack he'd carried his whole life. That meeting never made the news. There was no hashtag, but it changed two men, a veteran who had once been struck, and a man who once believed that anger was strength. They walked out of that room lighter than when they walked in. But the story didn't end there, because for people like Frank, legacy isn't built in words, it's in what's left behind. A bench, a bronze plaque, and something that makes people stop. No towering statue, no renamed street, just an old bench, and people choosing to pause instead of passing by. Sometimes that's the greatest legacy a veteran can leave. Madison Street had once been overlooked. Just an old wooden bench, a bus stop few people waited at, and a bar where people came to forget the day. But after Frank Delaney's story, things began to change. Not all at once, not with headlines, but through quiet gestures, just like the way Frank had always lived. A month after the ceremony, the city installed a small bronze plaque beside the bench. In honor of Frank Delaney, veteran, father, quiet strength. He never asked to be seen, he simply stood. No one was asked to stop by, but they did. School kids left flowers on Veterans Day. A local artist painted Frank's silhouette, faint, humble, into a mural titled "The Ones We Missed." A mother pointed to the bench and told her son that man was a real kind of strong. And Kyle, the man who once struck Frank, now volunteers as a driver for the local VA center. Twice a week, no one brings up the past. But many recognize him, not for what he did, but for who he's become. Sometimes they see him helping an elderly vet into a van or waiting patiently at a crosswalk, not to earn forgiveness, but because now he understands what Frank had always known. Respect doesn't need a loud voice. It just needs the right action. As for Frank, he still takes his walks every Tuesday morning. Same old coat, same wooden cane worn at the handle. But now, someone always greets him first. A nod. A knowing glance. A quiet, "Morning, sir." Frank didn't change the world, but he reminded a corner of it, that even in all the noise, some veterans choose to live quietly and kindly. And when someone like that is finally seen, the whole community learns to see itself too. The story didn't need to end with something grand. It just needed to be remembered. As a reminder, respect shouldn't come after the pain. No standing ovation, no audience, just a quiet morning, where a son sat beside his father, and for the first time neither needed to say a word, because everything that mattered had already been lived. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves turned and Madison Street wore its golden hue, Commander Delaney returned to town. No helicopter, no security detail, just him and a small bouquet of unmarked flowers. He walked to the familiar bench, still there, still clean. Beside the plaque bearing his father's name, the veteran he'd always honored but maybe never told enough. Frank was already there, a hot cup of coffee beside him. No surprise. No fanfare, just a subtle lift of his chin and a soft smile, as if he'd known his son would come. Delaney sat down, placed the flowers gently at the foot of the bench. They sat in silence for a long while, as if time itself was listening. At last, the son spoke. "You taught them something, Dad." You changed this place. Frank didn't look at him, just took a slow sip of coffee, eyes on a boy tying a tiny American flag to his bike handle. Maybe, he whispered, or maybe they just remembered what mattered. The two sat there, shoulder to shoulder, without talking about war or the past, because they knew legacy isn't what you say, it's how others start to live differently after meeting you. A soldier who had lived as a shield between the world and chaos, a father who never asked for praise, a veteran who chose silence, and in doing so made a whole community speak. A soft breeze passed by, leaves fell at their feet, and if you stood long enough at that corner, you might hear it. Not the sound of helicopters, but the sound of a town that once looked away, now learning to bow its head. If you believe respect shouldn't wait until after the pain, if you believe a veteran never truly takes off the uniform, even if all that's left is the slow walk down a quiet sidewalk, then share this story. Let people like Frank Delaney never sit alone again. And if you ever see someone silent, overlooked, don't walk past. Stop, because they might just be the reason you live in peace today.